Get one thing straight. Avoidants don't just wake up and text you out of the blue. That reconnection, it's not spontaneous, it's calculated, it's internal, and it's built on a quiet storm of overthinking. Avoidants operate through a nervous system that is wired for self-protection, not emotional pursuit. When they feel overwhelmed, criticized, or emotionally suffocated, their instinct is not to move toward connection, it's to pull away. This isn't because they don't care, it's because closeness often triggers a sense of vulnerability that feels unsafe to them. The moment they start to sense that their autonomy might be compromised, they default to what they know best: distance. Emotional safety to an avoidant means having control over their environment and emotional exposure. They need to feel that they won't be consumed by someone else's needs or expectations. This is why emotional intensity, even when it's well-meaning, can feel like a threat. To the anxious or emotionally expressive partner, reaching out, expressing love, or demanding clarity seems normal. But to an avoidant, those same actions can be interpreted as pressure or invasion. When an avoidant ends or distances themselves from a relationship, what they're doing is creating space to re-regulate. That silence, that emotional distance, they're not always about rejection. They're about self-preservation. In that space, they begin to regain their emotional footing. It's not a punishment to the other person. It's a defense mechanism they've likely used since childhood to manage overwhelming emotions. This is why pressuring an avoidant to reconnect before they feel ready often backfires. The hardest part is learning that stepping back is not giving up. It's giving them room to breathe. It's resisting the urge to emotionally pursue and instead letting your calm presence or even absence signal that you're no longer a source of pressure. That's what creates emotional safety for an avoidant. And when they feel emotionally safe, that's when they're most likely to re-engage, not because you demanded it, but because their system finally feels it's okay to come close again. When an avoidant begins to consider reconnecting, one of the first things they evaluate is whether or not you've stopped emotionally pursuing them. This isn't about games or power plays, it's about perceived emotional safety. Emotional pursuit, even if it comes from love and good intentions, can feel like pressure to someone with an avoidant attachment style. It threatens their deeply rooted need for autonomy and control over emotional closeness. Avoidants are wired to equate intimacy with danger. So when you chase them, question their silence, or try to pull them back emotionally, it often confirms their internal fear that closeness means losing themselves. The more you pursue, the more they pull away. This cycle reinforces their core belief: connection means I'll be overwhelmed. When the pursuit stops, everything shifts. Your silence, your emotional neutrality, becomes a signal. It tells the avoidant that the threat has lessened. It creates a pocket of space where they can start to evaluate the situation from a safer emotional distance. They begin to wonder, why aren't they chasing? Why aren't they trying to fix this? Have they moved on? And that space, while uncomfortable for both of you, is what begins to stir something in the avoidant that chasing never could: curiosity, reflection, and even regret. When the emotional pursuit stops, you no longer represent a source of intensity. You become emotionally neutral. That neutrality is what makes you feel emotionally safe to the avoidant's nervous system, gives them room to come back on their own terms, in their own time, without the pressure of performance or emotional urgency. This is often the phase where the avoidant will test the waters, liking a post, sending a casual text, or asking indirect questions. They're not ready to dive in head first. They're checking to see if the emotional climate has changed. Are you still waiting with open arms, ready to resume intensity? Or have you rebalanced your emotional center? And here's the truth. When you stop chasing, you create the very conditions that make reconnection possible. You're not signaling disinterest, you're signaling strength. You're not withdrawing love, you're withdrawing pressure. To an avoidant, that difference is everything. So if you're wondering why they seem to reappear after you've stopped trying, it's because they've sensed the shift. They no longer feel emotionally cornered. Your stillness says, I'm okay with or without this. And that emotional stance, rooted in self-respect, feels less threatening and more inviting to the avoidant. Avoidants evaluate the emotional climate before they re-engage. When they feel you've stopped emotionally pursuing them, it lowers the internal alarm bells. It tells them the dynamic has changed, and for the first time in a long time, they may feel safe enough to inch closer, not because you convinced them, but because your lack of pursuit gave them the space to choose it on their own. When avoidants consider reconnecting with someone from their past, they often face a difficult internal question. Do I miss the actual bond, or do I just miss the relief from emotional pressure? This distinction is subtle, but it's critical because avoidants, they often struggle to separate genuine emotional longing from the soothing effect of a temporarily removed emotional burden. In the moment, when a relationship starts feeling too intense, too close, or too emotionally demanding, the avoidant instinct is to pull away, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets closeness as a threat. So when they disconnect, it initially feels like a relief. The emotional intensity is gone. The pressure to show up, to talk, to explain, to feel, it all disappears. And that absence feels like control. It feels safe. But over time, something changes. The nervous system calms down. The threat fades. The avoidant is no longer emotionally flooded. And this is where reflection starts. When the avoidant is no longer overwhelmed, they begin to revisit the connection with clearer eyes. And here comes the conflict. Do they genuinely miss you, your presence, your soul, your shared connection? Or do they just miss the comfort they felt in not being emotionally pursued? And that's why many avoidants come back, not with clarity, but with confusion. They'll send a vague message, like a post, hover in your DMs. It's not always because they've had a full epiphany. It's often because they're testing whether re-entering your life would still bring the same emotional demand they ran from. They want to know if the dynamic has shifted, if the bond can exist without the pressure. They remember the warmth, the consistency, the safety you may have offered, but they also remember how emotionally cornered they felt at times. So they question, do I miss the connection, or do I just miss the feeling of being emotionally supported without being emotionally accountable? And that's why your stillness, your grounded absence is so powerful. It doesn't answer that question for them. It makes them answer it. It forces the avoidant to confront their feelings without you spoon-feeding them validation or comfort. Avoidance may seem emotionally detached on the surface, but underneath that cool exterior lies a fear most people overlook, the fear of rejection. Just because they're the ones who pull away doesn't mean they're immune to the sting of being pushed away. In fact, their entire defense system is built around avoiding that very feeling. So when they even begin to consider reconnecting with someone from their past, especially someone who may have once pursued them emotionally, they tread very carefully. Why? Because they want to know, is this safe? Is this low risk? Reconnection for an avoidant doesn't happen boldly. It happens subtly, quietly, almost invisibly. You might notice them liking an old photo, viewing your stories, or casually asking a mutual friend about you. That's not coincidence, it's calculation. They are gouded, warm, but not overly eager, safe, but not emotionally entangled. That registers as low risk. If you seem angry or indifferent, that registers as a threat. If you're too emotionally available, that may reignite their fear of being overwhelmed again. This is the paradox of avoidance. They long for connection, but only if it feels emotionally safe. They crave intimacy, but only if they feel they can remain in control. So the reconnection dance becomes a series of micro tests, nonverbal cues, timing, tone, distance, all calculated to minimize their exposure to emotional rejection. Here's the truth. If you're grounded, centered, and not seeking emotional reassurance from them, you become far more approachable to an avoidant. Your independence signals safety. Your boundaries say, you're welcome but not needed. That's magnetic. To someone who has spent their life fearing emotional engulfment, so when they test the waters, they aren't just checking on you, they're checking on them. Can they handle what might happen next? Will they be accepted without being smothered? Will they be wanted without being needed? The reconnection doesn't begin with a grand gesture. It begins in silence, in hesitation, in fear. And if they feel safe enough, low risk enough, they just might tiptoe back into connection, hoping it feels different this time. When an avoidant considers reconnecting with an ex or someone they distance themselves from, they don't just dive back in impulsively. They scan. Quietly, cautiously, and analytically, they assess whether the emotional environment that once triggered them has changed. And the biggest question on their mind is it still the same dynamic that overwhelmed me, or has something shifted? Avoidants don't leave relationships because they don't care. They often withdraw because the emotional intensity feels unsafe. The constant need for closeness, affirmation, and emotional availability, especially from anxious or overfunctioning partners, can activate their deep-seated fears of engulfment, loss of control, or vulnerability. So when they're gone for a while and they start to think about reconnecting, they aren't just thinking about you. They're thinking about the dynamic. They remember the emotional push-pull, the pressure to open up, the feeling of being pursued. That's what they're afraid of revisiting. So before they reach out, they look for signs. Have you changed? Do you still seek reassurance from them? Are you still emotionally intense? Or have you grown more self-regulated and grounded? Has the power balance shifted, or would reconnecting place them back in the same dynamic that pushed them to withdrawal in the first place? Avoidants are hypersensitive to emotional demand, even if it's subtle. So they look at everything with a filter. Your tone of voice, your social media posts, the energy you bring. Are you signaling growth and independence, or a desire to emotionally pull them back in? They're not just checking for interest, they're scanning for safety. They may re-enter communication slowly. They might accidentally run into you, reply to a story, or ask mutual friends how you've been. All of this is reconnaissance. It's their way of answering, will this feel different this time? And here's the thing, they aren't necessarily looking for you to change them. They're looking to see if the relationship energy is less demanding, more self-assured, more emotionally balanced. They want to feel like they can show up without immediately being expected to fill an emotional gap. They need to sense that their space will be respected, not challenged. What they fear most is walking back into a dynamic where their autonomy feels threatened. So they test for it carefully. Subconsciously, they may not even realize this is what they're doing, but every signal you send matters. This is why emotional growth on your end matters so much. Not to prove anything to them, but because it shifts the dynamic into one that's less about emotional dependency and more about mutual connection. If they sense the space feels safer, calmer, and less pressure-filled, they're far more likely to slowly lean in. It's not about whether they miss you. It's about whether they believe reconnecting with you will cost them their emotional freedom. If the answer is no, and the dynamic feels new, different, and healthier, they just might make their move. When an avoidant ex or partner decides to reconnect, it may feel like they're finally realizing your worth, but the truth is often more complex. Their decision to come back is rarely about you alone. It's not just that they miss you or that they've had a sudden change of heart. The real shift usually happens internally. It's about how they feel with themselves now, not necessarily just how they feel about you. Avoidants often disconnect from relationships when their emotional world becomes overwhelming. In the heat of the moment, they don't have the tools to self-regulate while staying connected. So they do what feels safest. They retreat. They convince themselves that they're better off alone, that closeness is suffocating, or that relationships just aren't for them. But once they've had time and space, a different process begins, one that has everything to do with them confronting their own discomfort. During this separation, avoidants don't typically spend their time reflecting on how great you were or how much they messed up. At first, they feel relief. Emotional distance gives them the sense of control they crave. But over time, silence doesn't just bring peace. It brings exposure. With nothing left to distract them from themselves, they start to encounter the deeper emotions they once suppressed. Loneliness, longing, and regret begin to creep in, not always about you directly, but about the experience of disconnection itself. Here's what's crucial to understand. Avoidants often need to feel more stable within before they can consider reconnecting with someone else. If they felt emotionally out of control in the relationship, they'll need to rebuild a sense of emotional regulation before they're willing to risk connection again. Not safe with you, necessarily safe with themselves. That's why their timing often feels confusing. You may have spent weeks or months proving your loyalty, love, or commitment, but none of that mattered until their internal climate shifted. When they finally feel less threatened by intimacy, less engulfed by their own emotional responses, and more in control of their inner world, that's when reconnection becomes an option. It's also why changes on your end, like pulling back, establishing boundaries, or embodying self-respect, can unintentionally support this process. When you stop overfunctioning, you reduce the emotional intensity they associate with the relationship. That gives them space to explore their own emotions on their own terms without pressure. And when they feel more emotionally grounded, the idea of reconnection stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a possibility. So when they reappear, don't rush to believe it's about you. It might be, but more likely it's about the new sense of inner safety they've developed.